If you're just joining us, we've got breaking news. 3 Americans being held by Russia are now on their way home. Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, and Alsu Kurmasheva, part of a large prisoner swap with Russia. We are awaiting details on the specifics, what prisoners America was willing to release to Russia in exchange for these 3 Americans. We don't know yet, but we do know this has been in the works for months. Apparently, Gershkovich, Whelan, and Kurmasheva right now are on their way to U.S., hopefully in U.S. custody soon. I want to bring in Olivia Gaza, CBS News Intelligence and National Security reporter. Olivia joins us now. Olivia, are you with us right now? Can you tell us what you know, what you're hearing about how this is all taking place?
Sure, Michael. Officials who have been intimately involved in what you accurately described as a month-long negotiation have described it to me as one of the most complex in U.S.-Russia history and even U.S.-Soviet history, when we, of course, all know spy swaps hit a crescendo. The reason for that is the number of players involved and the number of now political prisoners involved. The U.S., of course, disputing that either Evan Gershkovich or Paul Whelan were involved in any kind of espionage, finding them both to have been wrongfully detained by the Russians. Alsu Kurmasheva, also a journalist, the U.S. did not officially designate her in the course of its investigation to be wrongfully detained, but President Biden personally appealed for her release in April of this year, calling her out by name and calling on the Russians to release her. Speculation had been mounting that a deal was close when people who monitor prisons in Russia noticed that some high-profile political prisoners had been shifting around, had disappeared from rosters. Among them was Paul Whelan and another prominent Kremlin critic, Vladimir Kara-Murza. We are still awaiting final details of what this negotiation involved, which prisoners might be going where, but we do expect that these 3 American citizens expect to step on U.S. soil in a matter of hours tonight.
And Olivia, remind us, what had Russia charged these Americans with? What were they accused of doing?
Sure. Well, Paul Whelan is the longest-held American in Russia. He was detained there in 2018 and accused essentially of espionage, things that his family disputes, that he has vehemently disputed, that the State Department and U.S. government writ large has disputed. The same thing with Evan Gershkovich, who traveled to Russia on a reporting trip, was detained there in 2023, accused of espionage. And in both of these men's cases, convicted of these charges and sentenced to long sentences in Russian penal colonies. Paul Whelan, of course, serving out a number of years already, and Evan Gershkovich recently sentenced in July. Alsu Kurmasheva, in a similar sort of rushed trial earlier in July, was sentenced to 6.5 years. She was accused of spreading false information about the Russian military. The U.S. administration obviously views all of these as trumped-up charges and as Russia trying to negotiate for political prisoners, things that it's taken with caprice and without real cause.
These 3 Americans coming home, obviously a tremendous relief, not just for the families, but for all Americans. But did Vladimir Putin also get what he wanted, too, in terms of using American lives as bargaining chips to get prisoners released? Is this a win for him, too?
Well, apart from a win for him, it's not without a cost to the U.S., right? We are still awaiting the details of who was swapped for whom. We do know it's been publicly reported that the Russians have had their eyes on a convicted murderer held in a German prison whose name is Vadim Krasikov. That had been their area of focus. They had repeatedly expressed interest in getting his release, but he was not in U.S. custody. He was in German custody. So that was obviously a snare in the early negotiations in this deal. We, again, still need to confirm who the Russians exactly are getting in exchange for these 3 high-profile Americans. The Biden administration has managed to secure over the past 3.5 years the release of more than 60 hostages and wrongful detainees, but very few of them have attained the level of prominence and gotten the following that these Russian cases have.
I want to bring in Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News senior foreign correspondent. Elizabeth, you were in court for Paul Whelan's trial in Russia. What can you tell us about how that process played out?
It was back in the winter of 2018, and Paul Whelan looked blindsided. The circumstances of his arrest were very peculiar. He'd made friends online with some members of the Russian military. He's an ex-Marine, U.S. Marine. And eventually one of them had invited him to a wedding in Moscow. So he went, and as a wedding guest, he'd come down into the lobby of his hotel, and suddenly the FSB showed up and arrested him and said that he had a thumb drive in his pocket full of classified material. Now, we never saw evidence of that. His family says he never saw evidence of it either. And just as in Gershkovich's case, we were never allowed to stay in the courtroom past the first few minutes, which was kind of a photo op where we got to see Paul Whelan. He was standing in the dock, that prisoner's dock in the Russian style behind glass, and he just looked completely stunned. He couldn't believe it was happening. He then went away and spent almost 6 years in a Russian jail. So he has been the longest incarcerated, and I noticed looking at him, he has lost quite a lot of weight since those first few days, but he still looks pretty well, actually, considering what's happened in the meantime. His case was a little diplomatically difficult because although he'd been a U.S. service member, he also held a Canadian and Irish passport. And so there was some diplomatic shuffle trying to figure out which government needed to go to bat for him. And certainly the U.S. had the most power and influence, and in the end has really stepped up. And today his family will be ecstatic to think that he's finally on the way home.
Well, Elizabeth, it was just about 2 weeks ago that Evan Gershkovich was sentenced in Russia. What can you tell us about that process?
That may have been the very first inkling we had that a deal was being cooked up, because he should have been not tried yet. In other words, his original court date was later this month. And suddenly we got news that it had been moved ahead a full month at the request of his defense lawyers. And we know that the Russians had floated the idea of this prisoner swap, but had said categorically it couldn't take place until Gershkovich's trial was over. So the defense lawyers saying, all right, let's get it underway, was a signal that they needed a sentence in order to move on to freedom. Indeed, as soon as that sentence was delivered, it was very harsh, 16 years. There began to be a little bit of buzz around the fact that the talks were really going to come to fruition, and he too would be on his way home. His parents, I can't imagine how thrilled and relieved they are.
And we have focused on the three Americans, but there's also a prominent British citizen with U.S. ties being released. What can you tell us about him?
Vladimir Kara-Murza. He is a longtime dissident, incredibly brave. He's long worked on human rights issues and, in fact, earned the respect of John McCain, Senator McCain. And shortly before McCain's death, he asked in an email whether Kara-Murza would be one of the pallbearers. So if you look at the photographs of Senator McCain's funeral now, you'll see Vladimir Kara-Murza among the pallbearers, along with President Biden, incidentally. He then, even from jail, began to write, kept on writing very punchy and well-reasoned critiques of Putin's government and the gross human rights abuses that were continuing, and in fact won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for those writings. He believes he was poisoned twice by the FSB, maybe as a warning, but he survived both times. Though his health is thought to be very fragile. So it's of particular, I think, relief to his family that he's getting out of Russian custody, because he won't have been getting the medical care that he needed to, to thrive.
Elizabeth, at this point, do we have any sense of who the Russians could be getting in return?
Well, the only name is the one that Olivia mention Vadim Krasikov. He's been at the top of the list for a long time, and that indicates that the Germans have agreed to be part of this swap because they're the ones who have him in custody. There's also some speculation in the Russian press that there will be a handful of Russian spies disguised as diplomats who've been arrested over the years, one in Norway, perhaps, another one in somewhere in Europe, and they will be sent home as opposed to having to cool their heels in European jails. But their details on that are very scant at the moment. We're just going to have to wait and see.
I want to bring Olivia back in. A deal like this, a massive prisoner swap, can you talk about how many agencies, and this is not just multiple agencies in the U.S., but also multiple countries involved, how large is the scope of a deal like this?
Right. Well, I think we're still awaiting details on who exactly was involved, but we do know multiple government agencies, including the White House, the State Department, and the CIA, which has what's referred to as a special channel with the Russians in order to discuss swaps like these, just given the long-standing, again, history going back to Soviet times when spy swaps were much more frequent. This scenario is different. It is not a spy swap. This, again, appears to involve a number of political prisoners, which makes it more fraught because there's nothing to acknowledge in terms of wrongdoing. In fact, the U.S. has maintained that Alsu and Evan and Paul have been completely innocent in all of these cases. In Whelan's case, I want to highlight in particular, I mean, Liz just laid out exactly why this is so poignant for him. Also why? Because he was passed over effectively twice in prior negotiations that U.S. administrations engaged in. Trevor Reed was released in a swap for a Russian pilot in 2022. And then Brittany Griner, the WNBA star, was released in December of 2023 in exchange for a known Russian arms dealer, Victor Bout, all while Paul continued to be held in Russia. So the fact that he is being released today is also a result of pressure mounting on the administration. You cannot leave him behind once again. And in fact, U.S. officials have been speaking publicly to the fact that they are absolutely determined to bring both Paul and Evan home. Earlier this month, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said as much on stage at an Aspen conference where he said the U.S. and President Biden were determined to bring both of them home. He spoke elliptically about possibly a deadline at the end of this month, which raised some eyebrows in the audience. And the special hostage envoy, Roger Carstens, also spoke publicly about these efforts to free both men, in addition to Alsu in dealing with the Russians.
Well, Olivia, you bring up a good point because I remember it was just last month, July 4th, the Whelan family said that Paul Whelan spending another Independence Day in Russian prison. How hard, we've talked about how hard the government has been working for this deal. How hard have the families been working? What have they had to do to try and keep their loved ones in the spotlight?
Absolutely. In Paul's case, it really has been a family effort, and Liz spoke to it as well. His brother has been working very hard to maintain contact with press outlets. They understand that keeping his name in the press keeps him relevant and keeps attention on his situation. They would always send updates when he underwent a transfer, when he was beaten in prison, which happened. He managed to, in recent weeks, secure a Russian cell phone and was managing to call members of the press and U.S. government officials, including the special hostage envoy, to provide an update on his case and hopefully get an update on where things stand for him. Of course, it's an open line. Russian officials are listening in the entire time, so you can't explain all of it. But he has been trying to reach out and personally make his case to U.S. government officials and press. His sister, Elizabeth, has consistently traveled to Washington in order to advocate for his release. Again, getting in government officials' faces in order to say, you can't pass over Paul another time.
Elizabeth, I want to go back to you. As I understand it, you've spoken to the Whelan family. Can you tell us what you've heard?
His brother lives in Toronto, and he has been leading the charge, trying to keep Paul's case front and center. He was tireless, very much encouraged by the American embassy in Russia. While it was able to, the American ambassador kept visiting Whelan, even during the years of COVID, when I think to Paul Whelan, he, must have felt that he was forgotten about. His brother was a very good correspondent, and he's eloquent in his emails, and I think he, more than anybody, managed to keep this case alive and will deserve a huge amount of the credit, and I'm sure Paul's gratitude when he finally gets to give him a great big hug.
It's a tremendous relief, I think, for all Americans. Olivia, I want to ask about the significance of this prisoner swap. We're talking about 24 prisoners. Now, we have cut deals with Russia before, the U.S. government. This is a pretty large-scale deal. Is this the largest in recent memory?
It is the most complex in recent memory. Officials who were involved in the negotiations described it to me as the most complex in U.S.-Russia and even U.S.-Soviet relations, precisely because of the number of players involved and the type of prisoners involved here. We talked about the agencies that are involved, the White House, the State Department, the CIA. All of them would have had discrete roles in dealing with the Russians in trying to secure these prisoners' release. And as you were talking with Ambassador Sullivan earlier, there is, of course, a cost that the U.S. always factors into these decisions that they make, right? They look closely as to whether the people that they may be releasing go back to a life of crime, whether they go back and pose a threat to the United States. And when the special hostage envoy was speaking earlier this month, he said in recent years that has not been the case. The calculus that the U.S. has made in order to make these exchanges has wound up being relatively safe in terms of U.S. interest. It has paid off in terms of getting Americans home and releasing, in some cases, the convicted criminals that they have released in order to secure Americans' freedom.
And right now we are joined on the phone by John Sullivan. He was U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022, and he is now a CBS News contributor. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for joining us on the phone. First, I want to get your reaction to this prisoner swap, the release of these Americans.
Well, thanks. Good morning. It's great to be with you. This is literally a big deal. Lots of moving parts, different countries involved, complex not just for the U.S. government, all the different agencies that were mentioned, but different countries involved, which makes this really unusual. And the scale, the number of people who are being moved today, it is large, it is impactful, but it comes at a cost to the United States. The United States is releasing convicted Russian criminals, and as I understand it, there's an FSB colonel. The FSB is the principal successor to the KGB, who is in custody in Berlin serving a life sentence for murder, sent to commit a murder by the Russian government in Berlin. So there is a cost to the United States and to our allies, but the calculus that was made was that getting all of these people out, including someone like Paul Whelan, whom I consider a friend, he and his family, who's been detained for almost 6 years now. It's a great day for them and their families.
Well, Ambassador, I think anytime Americans come home safely, it's cause for celebration. But does this also give incentive to Vladimir Putin to do this again, to take Americans as bargaining chips to get more prisoners released in the future?
Of course it does. This does not signal a change in U.S.-Russia relations. The way I would characterize it, the way I would think of it from Putin's perspective, Putin believes he's at war with the United States. He would treat this as basically an exchange of prisoners of war during wartime. There's no improvement in U.S.-Russia relations. U.S. citizens in Moscow, in Russia, are at risk of being detained without cause and used by the Russian government for trades just like this.
Ambassador, if you can give us some context as to the state of U.S.-Russia relations. I've heard it said that we're at the lowest point since the Cold War. Do you think that's accurate?
No. If it's from the Cold War, this is the lowest point it's been in my lifetime, which predates the end of the Cold War. It's as bad as one could possibly imagine. I speak a lot about the war in Ukraine and U.S.-Russia relations, and particularly to an American audience, as I describe the situation, U.S.-Russia relations, the state of the war. I start off by saying, as bad as you think it is, it's even worse than you think.
Well, Ambassador, we're going to continue this conversation with us. Thanks for being here. But we're learning more details all the time about this massive prisoner swap that's going to lead to the release of Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, Alsu Kurmasheva, 3 Americans held in Russia, now on their way home. We're going to take a short break, and we'll have more details for you coming up.